Part 1. The Last Day of Summer. The last day of summer in St Mary Mead carried that peculiar hush that comes when the year's about to turn. Bees still worked among the hollyhocks, but their industry sounded weary. The air smelled faintly of apples beginning to sweeten and of wood smoke from the first cautious fires. Miss Jane Marple sat by her sitting-room window with her knitting, eyes half on her needles, half on the slow drift of petals in the garden. She had always thought autumn fairs a melancholy business, like birthdays after a certain age. The bunting would flutter bravely enough, the cakes be iced, the children shriek with delight. Yet under it all one could sense the year's fatigue, a small sadness in every cheerful preparation. Still, she reflected, such events were important to a village. They drew people together, revealed their tempers, and, if one watched closely, showed what lay beneath polite surfaces. From her window she could see young Tommy Briggs struggling with a hammer while his sister held a plank that was clearly too heavy for her. Across the green, Mrs. Hartnell and the vicar's wife were engaged in one of their gentle skirmishes about the placement of stalls, their gestures fluttering like hens disputing a worm. All was comfortingly familiar, and Miss Marple's thin lips curved in amusement. Human nature, she thought, did not really alter. It merely changed costume with the seasons. A soft knock sounded at her door. When she called, "Come in," her maid ushered in Mr. Julian Simmons, the new schoolmaster. He was tall, pale, and so conscious of his spectacles that he pushed them up his nose every few seconds as though to reassure himself they were still there. He carried a sheaf of pamphlets. "I do beg your pardon, Miss Marple," he began, producing a nervous smile. "The committee asked me to distribute these notices about the autumn fair. There's to be a competition for preserves, and Mrs. Price Ridley insisted I encourage you to enter your, damson jam." "How kind of her," said Miss Marple, accepting a leaflet. "But I believe I shall let others have their moment. There's no sport in competing when one knows the result beforehand." Mr. Simmons laughed politely, then hesitated. "You've lived here a long time, haven't you? I was reading old parish papers. There was a fair here in 1898 that ended rather tragically. A fire, apparently. One fatality. Do people still talk of it?" Miss Marple looked thoughtful. "Not often. I was a girl then, staying in Torquay with an aunt. I remember hearing of it later. The fortune-teller's tent. Was it not? They said a lamp overturned. So the records say. No culprit ever found." "Ah," murmured Miss Marple. "Such things fade conveniently. Villagers prefer their ghosts properly buried. They make tidier neighbors that way." The schoolmaster blinked at her, uncertain whether she jested. She smiled gently, and the tension left his shoulders. A few more pleasantries, and he took his leave, pamphlets under his arm, already fretting about the next door to knock upon. Miss Marple watched him cross the lane. Fires, forgotten deaths, whispered accidents. Such memories lay in the soil of every parish, like seeds waiting only for the right weather to sprout. She returned to her knitting, but her thought had already strayed from wool to human nature, that more intricate pattern. By late afternoon the sun sank behind the elms, turning their leaves to copper. The air smelled of damp earth and ripe plums. Miss Marple decided on a short walk before tea. Along the lane she met Mrs. Bunting, the vicar's wife, arms full of chrysanthemums destined for the church stall. "My dear Miss Marple, you're just the person I needed," cried Mrs. Bunting. "Would you help tomorrow with the prize lists? The Reverend has managed to misplace half the entries." "Of course," said Miss Marple. "It will be a pleasant diversion." They walked together toward the church gate. Mrs. Bunting, who could never resist sharing information, lowered her voice to a confidential flutter. "We've engaged a rather unusual gentleman for this year's fair, a Mr. Bartholomew Crow. Fortune-telling with cards and crystals. I do hope it isn't too worldly." Miss Marple's eyes twinkled. "I should think the future is safe enough, my dear. It seldom happens as predicted." Mrs. Bunting laughed, relieved, and hurried off with the flowers. Miss Marple watched her go, then looked toward the green where the stalls were taking shape, bright canvas against the darkening sky. Somewhere a hammer struck its final blow, and the sound echoed like the closing of a door. Saturday arrived with a crisp brightness peculiar to English Septembers. The autumn fair opened at 11 under strings of bunting that trembled in the breeze. There were jams and cakes, knitted mittens, old books, a second-hand toy store. The roundabout wheezed its tune while children clutched sticky apples. The smell of toffee, sawdust, and damp grass mingled pleasantly. Miss Marple, escorted by Colonel Melchay, the retired chief constable, moved slowly through the crowd. The colonel had kept his commanding voice in military stride, though time had introduced a certain wheeze to both. "Fine turnout, Jane," he boomed, "just like old times. Good for morale, these affairs." "Indeed," said Miss Marple, eyeing a row of cake with interest, though morale occasionally suffers after the judging. They paused before a striped tent whose painted sign announced Bartholomew Crow, Seer of Destiny. The smell of incense drifted out, oddly at variance with the damp canvas. Presently Mr. Crow emerged, a tall man, black-haired, perhaps 40. His smile won practice a revealed charm without warmth. "Madam, Colonel," he said with a bow, "a glimpse of the unseen world, perhaps? I can tell you what tomorrow hides." "Tomorrow hides rain," said the colonel. "Barometers dropping." Crow's smile did not falter. "Ah, but storms may cleanse as well as spoil. Won't you sit for a reading, madam?" "Thank you, no," replied Miss Marple kindly. "At my age one future grows delightfully short. The suspense, you see, is minimal." The fortune-teller gave a short laugh, uncertain whether to be flattered or mocked. Miss Marple's blue eyes met his for a moment, and something flickered there, a guardedness, a watchfulness, as though each were quietly taking the other's measure. Then the crowd pressed forward, and the moment passed. They moved on toward the refreshment tent, where Mrs. Price Ridley presided like a general over her teapots. Miss Marple took a seat at a small table and watched the stream of visitors. Human nature on display, the boastful, the timid, the greedy, the self-satisfied. It was a panorama she never tired of. Yet today, beneath the laughter, she sensed a faint discord, as though some note of unease trembled in the air, unheard but felt. Toward mid-afternoon the judging of preserves ended in mild scandal when Mrs. Hartnell accused Mrs. Wright of substituting bought sugar for fay trade. Colonel Melchay was called upon to mediate, which he did with military brevity. The raffle followed. The organ struck up a jaunty waltz, and the fair settled into its cheerful rhythm. Then came the cry. A child screamed near the fortune-teller's tent. Sharp, piercing, cutting through music and chatter. Voices rose. People began to run. Miss Marple set down her teacup and followed the colonel toward the commotion. The crowd had gathered in a half-circle outside the tent. The striped canvas sagged oddly, one pole leaning. Within, chairs lay overturned, a tablecloth dragged askew. On the ground, half hidden by the fallen flap, lay Mr. Bartholomew Crow. Someone shouted for the doctor. Another said he'd fainted. But Miss Marple, kneeling beside him, saw the stillness of true death, the slack hands, the eyes fixed upon nothing. A teapot had spilled across the grass, and with it came a faint, unmistakable odor, bitter almonds. She touched the pulse at his throat, then looked up at the colonel. "You had better send for Dr. Haydock," she said quietly, "and perhaps Sergeant Lake. I'm afraid Mr. Crow has gone where even his crystal cannot follow." Melchay bent down, frowning. "Good Lord, you think?" "Cyanide, I fancy," Miss Marple murmured. Such an unromantic ending for one who trafficked in destiny. A gasp ran through the onlookers. Miss Marple rose, brushing grass from her skirt. She noticed, almost absently, a torn playing card near the dead man's hand. The Queen of Hearts, stained where tea had soaked the ground. Near it lay an overturned teacup, its rim chipped. Someone had shared tea with Mr. Crow very recently. Within the hour, Dr. Haydock confirmed what Miss Marple had suspected. "Poison," he said grimly, corking a small sample bottle. "Instantaneous, I should think. Tea laced with cyanide. Nasty business." Colonel Melchay's expression hardened into the old professional mask. "Right. Nobody leaves the green until we've spoken to them. Miss Marple, I'd be grateful if you'd keep an eye on things. Quietly, of course. You have a knack of seeing what others miss." Miss Marple inclined her head. Sometimes it is merely that others look away. As the crowd thinned into uneasy knots, she stood beside the fallen tent, observing. The fortune-teller's crystal ball had rolled into the grass, reflecting fragments of bunting and cloud. Children were being shepherded home. Mrs. Bunting wept softly into her gloves. The fair, so lively an hour before, now seemed a stage off the curtain fall. Props abandoned, laughter ghostly. Miss Marple turned to the Colonel. The question, I suppose, is whether the poison was meant for Mr. Crow, or for someone else's fortune. Melche grunted. We'll soon see. But how in blazes does poison turn up in a teapot at a village fair? Miss Marple's eyes followed the fluttering bunting, now tattered by the wind. Ah, Colonel, there are always many ways of bitterness to steep unnoticed. One need only add hot water. She gave a small sigh. Human nature, after all, is much the same as jam. It preserves sweetly enough until something sours a fruit. The wind carried the scent of smoke and sugar, mingled now with a faint, acrid trace of almonds. Autumn had truly begun. Part 2. Whispers among the bunting. The morning after the fair broke pale and unsettled, as though the village itself hesitated between mourning and gossip. A light mist clung to the hedgerows. The grass along the lane was silvered with dew. St Mary Mead, usually so brisk in its return to order, seemed oddly subdued. Curtains twitched, doors opened and shut, and here and there milk bottles stood forgotten on the doorstep, its owner already deep in conversation about the events of the previous day. Miss Jane Marple, however, began her Sunday precisely as she always did, with a small tray, a pot of tea, and the Times propped against the toast rack. Her morning routine, she had long found, was the best soil in which to cultivate thought. Between bites of buttered toast she considered the facts, which were few but telling. A man, Bartholomew Crow, calling himself a fortune-teller, dead at the fair, his teacup laced with cyanide. No sign of a struggle, no convenient suicide note, no hint of the usual domestic motives, for Mr. Crow had been but a visitor to their quiet world, a stranger, and yet someone had wanted him silenced. Why? The police, she reflected, would proceed in their accustomed manner, questioning, collecting fingerprints, examining the cup. All perfectly sound, but they would overlook, perhaps, the subtler patterns, the expressions that flickered too quickly across familiar faces, the silences that spoke louder than grief. She stirred her tea absently. Poisoning, of course, required a certain intimacy. One could hardly slip cyanide into a man's cup without being near him, and Mr. Crow's tent had not lacked visitors that day. If only, she thought, she could recall which of them had emerged last. At that moment, her maid entered with a note. From Mrs. Bunting, Miss, send the boy over special. Miss Marple unfolded it. The vicar's wife's hand trembled visibly on the page. My dear Miss Marple, the Colonel asked me to invite you to the vicarage this morning. He and Dr. Haydock wish to speak with you about yesterday's dreadful affair. I hope you are well after such a shock. Yours affectionately, Mildred Bunting. Miss Marple smiled faintly. They wish to speak with me, she murmured, which means, of course, they wish me to speak for them. She finished her tea, straightened her hat, and set off for the vicarage. The vicarage stood white and prim behind a row of yews, its drawing-room already crowded with the village's more officious minds. Colonel Melche, broad and pink, occupied the hearthrug like an invading army. Dr. Haydock, brisk and sardonic, lounged by the window. Mrs. Bunting fluttered among the teacups, pale with anxiety. Ah, Jane, said the Colonel, relieved. Glad you could come. We've got a nasty puzzle on our hands, and, well, you've a knack for these things. Miss Marple inclined her head modestly. I have only a habit of noticing small oddities, Colonel. They sometimes add up. Quite, said Dr. Haydock dryly, and sometimes they add up faster than we can manage. He passed her a cup of tea. We've confirmed your diagnosis. Cyanide, right enough. Must have been in the tea itself. The pot, not the cup. Crow poured for both himself and whoever was with him. Was it known who that person was? Asked Miss Marple. Melche shook his head. That's the trouble. Nobody admits to being the last visitor. Several people claim to have gone in shortly before. Mrs. Price Ridley, young Emily Briggs, even the vicar's wife here. Mrs. Bunting gasped. Oh, but only for a moment. He said something rather, well, unsettling about a shadow in water. I thought it quite improper and left at once. Miss Marple regarded her kindly. Did he offer you tea, my dear? No, thank heaven. He was just pouring some when I came away. Miss Marple nodded slowly. Then he was alive, alert, and about to drink when you departed. And after you, who next? Possibly Mrs. Price Ridley, said the colonel. She's evasive, says she may have stopped by later in the day. Can't recall the hour. You know how she is. Miss Marple smiled. Indeed. Time becomes wonderfully elastic when one has something to hide, if only vanity. Dr. Haydock interjected. There's more. We've looked into Crow's background. Turns out he wasn't a Crow at all. Real name, Bartleby Crone. Once worked with a traveling fair up north. Bit of a shady record. Small frauds, fortune-telling licenses unpaid. Nothing violent, but plenty disreputable. Ah, murmured Miss Marple. So a man accustomed to pretending. Those who make a living from deceit often end by deceiving themselves. Did he have any luggage? A small trunk at the inn, said Melcher. Mostly stage stuff, cards, a robe, a few trinkets. Though there was one curious thing, a packet of old photographs tied up with ribbon. Young woman, dark-haired, different poses, different years, but always the same face. Miss Marple looked down at her folded hands. A sentimentalist, perhaps, or a blackmailer. The colonel stared. Blackmailer? Good Lord! Consider, she said gently, a fortune-teller has a perfect guise for learning secrets. People tell such men the very things they conceal from their families. Suppose he discovered something profitable. Mrs. Bunting set down her cup with a clatter. You don't mean someone in St Mary Mead? My dear, Miss Marple said softly, it is rarely strangers who kill. They may bring the weapon, but the motive usually belongs to home. By noon, the mist had cleared and the village was alive with whispers. At the butcher's, Mr. Briggs declared that poison was always the work of women, too clever by half, the lot of 'em. At the post office, Miss Hartnell confided that she'd seen Crow speaking earnestly to Mrs. Wright near the duck pond the evening before the fair. And at the Blue Boar, men drank to the notion that the fortune-teller had been some sort of spy. St. Mary Mead, once placid, now simmered like jam left too long on the boil. Miss Marple, meanwhile, walked to the green, where remnants of the fair still lay scattered, a torn ribbon, a sticky paper cup, a trampled chrysanthemum. The fortune-teller's tent had been taken down, leaving only a pale rectangle of flattened grass. Yet in her mind you could still see it. The overturned chair, the broken teacup, the card face down in the mud. She stooped to examine the ground. A few footprints, blurred by dew. Near the spot where the table had stood, something glinted, a small brass button, ornamental, the sort used on women's gloves. She slipped it into her handkerchief and continued walking. At the edge of the green stood Emily Briggs, the carpenter's daughter, thin and nervous, hugging her shawl about her. Miss Marple approached with her usual gentle courtesy. My dear, you were one of the last to see poor Mr. Crow, were you not? Emily nodded. I suppose so. He told me I'd meet a tall, dark stranger. I thought it a silly joke. And did you take tea with him? Oh, no. He had a pot already poured, but he seemed queer. Said his head hurt. I left quick. Miss Marple watched her face, sincere, frightened. You didn't happen to notice anyone waiting outside? The girl hesitated. Only Mrs. Price Ridley, I think. She was carrying a small basket, like she'd brought him something. Indeed, said Miss Marple. You've been very helpful, my dear. And remember, truth is always simpler to recall than invention. Emily looked puzzled, but curtsied and hurried off. That afternoon the colonel called again, exasperation in every line of his face. Confound it, Jane. The analysis shows the teapot was clean except for the residue in Crow's cup, meaning the poison was put in after the tea was poured. Then, Miss Marple said softly, someone added it by hand, possibly under pretense of sweetening. Exactly, but we've accounted for everyone nearby except Price Ridley, and she swears she never so much as touched the pot. Miss Marple's needles clicked thoughtfully. People rarely swear to what is entirely untrue, Colonel. More often they arrange errors around the edge of truth, like embroidery to disguise a tear. She paused, then added, "I wonder whether Mr. Crow's cards might yield a clue. You recall the Queen of Hearts? That card seldom lies." The Colonel frowned. "Meaning?" "Meaning love, of course, or jealousy, but also, in certain readings, a woman of authority and temper. Does that suggest anyone?" "Half the parish," he said grimly. Miss Marple smiled. "Perhaps, but only one with a motive as well." Evening settled early, painting the thatch roofs in gold. Miss Marple sat once more by her window, the brass button gleaming faintly in her palm. She had seen such buttons before, on Mrs. Price Ridley's gloves, in fact, worn the very day of the fair. But she did not leap to conclusions. Human beings were careless creatures, and buttons detached themselves in the most innocent circumstances. Yet her mind, neat as her knitting, began to weave the pattern. The stranger who trafficked in secrets, the respectable woman with much to lose, the cup poured and the almond scent rising like confession. Still, she told herself, conjecture must wait upon evidence. She had learned that even wickedness required proof. As the church bell tolled 8, there came a knock upon her door. It was the Colonel again, hat in hand, face grave. "Bad news. Jane," he said. "Price Ridley's been found in her garden shed, dead. Gas fire left on. Looks like suicide." Miss Marple looked at him steadily. "Or like someone wished it to." He blinked. "You think?" "I think," she said softly, "that our affairs yielded 2 fortunes now, both ill. And perhaps the real reader of destinies was never Mr. Crow at all." The Colonel sank into a chair. "Then by heaven, who—" Miss Marple poured him tea, plain, unsweetened. "Let us wait until morning, Colonel. Truth, like jam, sets better overnight." Outside, the wind rattled the empty store frames on the green. Somewhere a dog barked once, then fell silent. St. Mary Mead slept uneasily, dreaming of poison and prophecy. Part 3. The Woman with the Brass Button. Approx 1,500 words, written for voice-over narration in Joan Hickson's voice. Morning crept softly over St. Mary Mead, its light thin and strained, as though uncertain how to shine on a village shadowed by 2 deaths in as many days. The mist lingered longer than usual, curling low along the lanes and hedgerows. It was a kind of morning, Miss Marple thought, when sound travelled oddly, too sharp, too near, and even the birds seemed reluctant to sing. Mrs. Price Ridley's suicide, as the village already called it, had been discovered by her charwomen just after dawn. The gas fire in the small garden shed had been turned on full, and the door bolted from within. Her body, they said, was peaceful, too peaceful, perhaps. Miss Marple, however, was not one to mistake appearances for truth. By 8:30 she had already taken her hat and gloves and was on her way to the vicarage, where Colonel Melcher and Inspector Craddock had set up their impromptu headquarters. She walked slowly, her mind occupied not with grief but with a curious order of events. If Mrs. Price Ridley had indeed poisoned the fortune-teller, her suicide might be viewed as confession. But if she had not, then her death served a more sinister purpose, to silence her. As she approached the vicarage gate, she saw the Colonel pacing before the house, pipe unlit, brows drawn. "Ah, Jane," he called. "You've heard, I suppose." "I have," Miss Marple replied quietly, "and I am sorry for it, though I fear my sorrow is tempered by doubt." The Colonel grunted. "Doubt, eh? Well, you're not alone. Craddock thinks the same. He's inside, talking to the doctor." They entered together. In the study, Inspector Craddock looked up from his notes, a young man, earnest, intelligent, and increasingly aware that Miss Marple's gentle voice often reached truths his methods could not. "Morning, Miss Marple," he said. "I rather hoped you'd come. We've been discussing certain peculiarities." "Peculiarities," she repeated mildly. "That is usually where truth begins." "Indeed. First, the gas meter. It shows that the fire had been running for less than 10 minutes. Second, there were traces of chloroform on the rug near the body. Third, no fingerprints on the valve or the latch." Miss Marple raised her brows. "Then our poor lady did not die by her own hand." "It would appear not," said Craddock grimly. "And yet the shed was bolted from the inside." Miss Marple's needles clicked softly. Bolted, yes, but perhaps not by the occupant. In old sheds a latch may be drawn with a string passed through a crack in the boards. It is an old trick, Inspector, one sometimes used by mischievous boys to lock their sisters in. The colonel let out a low whistle. Good Lord, Jane, you mean she was murdered? I mean, said Miss Marple gently, that she was inconveniently alive. By late morning, the gossip in St Mary Mead had reached a fever pitch. Mrs. Bantried declared that she'd always known Mrs. Price Ridley would come to a bad end, too fond of other people's business. Mrs. Weatherby insisted it was a fortune-teller's curse, and Miss Hartnell confided darkly that the devil himself had walked the fairgrounds that day. Miss Marple, however, preferred her own counsel. She walked to the green once more, this time pausing near the duck pond where Crow had been seen speaking to Mrs. Wright on the eve of the fair. The water was murky with fallen leaves. A single feather drifted like a thought unanchored. Mrs. Wright's cottage stood nearby, its little garden neat and overtended. As Miss Marple approached, the widow appeared in the doorway, a handsome woman of 4 to 5, dark-haired, with a sort of poise that comes from habitually guarding one's emotions. "Good morning, Mrs. Wright," Miss Marple said pleasantly. "I trust you're bearing up under all this excitement." "Oh, Miss Marple, it's dreadful, quite dreadful," the woman replied, clutching her shawl. "2 deaths. I can hardly believe it." "Yes, poor Mrs. Price Ridley," Miss Marple murmured. "Such a sudden end. I was thinking, she must have been rather troubled lately. One wonders if perhaps someone had frightened her." Mrs. Wright hesitated. "Frightened her? Whatever do you mean?" "Oh, nothing particular," Miss Marple said lightly. "Only that I happened to find a button near the fortune-teller's tent. Brass, decorative, of a style she sometimes wore. I wondered if she'd lost it there." For just a fraction of a second, Mrs. Wright's composure faltered, eyes flickering, breath caught. Then she smiled too quickly. "I can't imagine. She was never one for fays." "No." Miss Marple's tone was mild. Then perhaps it belonged to someone else. She glanced toward the window. "I see you a fine collection of autumn roses. You must find great solace in your garden." "Oh, yes," said Mrs. Wright, grateful for the change of subject. "It's all that keeps me occupied now my husband's gone." "Ah, yes," Miss Marple murmured. "He was with the railway, was he not? Such a tragic accident." Mrs. Wright's eyes darkened. "Tragic? Yes, though some might call it convenient." "Convenient?" The woman's lips thinned. "For those who needed him out of the way. But that's all past now. I prefer not to dwell." Miss Marple inclined her head. "Quite so. Still, the past is a way of waiting for the present to catch up, don't you find?" That afternoon, back in her cottage, Miss Marple reviewed her notes. 2 deaths, 1 fortune-teller, and an old photograph of a dark-haired woman, perhaps the same one now pruning roses too precisely at her window. She was interrupted by a soft knock. It was Emily Briggs, pale and uneasy. "Beg pardon, Miss Marple, but I thought you ought to see this. I was helping clear Mrs. Price Ridley's things, and I found this tucked in her sewing box." It was a photograph, creased, faded, but unmistakable. A younger Mrs. Wright, smiling arm in arm with a man Miss Marple did not know, yet whose resemblance to the dead fortune-teller was impossible to miss. "Thank you, my dear," Miss Marple said quietly. "You've done the village a great service." "What should I do, miss? Tell the police." "In due time. For now, leave it with me. And say nothing to anyone, not even your mother." When the girl had gone, Miss Marple sat very still. The pattern, once tangled, now began to clear. Crow, real name Bartleby Crone, had known Mrs. Wright once, perhaps too well. A love affair? A betrayal? He had returned to St. Mary Mead under a false name, and his death had silenced him forever. But who had reason to kill him now, after all these years? Mrs. Price Ridley, busybody though she was, had likely guessed at something, perhaps seen a familiar face, or heard a careless remark. And for that, she too had been silenced. That evening, the colonel called once more. "Jane," he said, "we've dug up more on Crow. Seems he once worked a circuit with a Mrs. Lydia Wright. Same surname, mind you, though it could be coincidence. They posed as mediums, read fortunes, sometimes relieved lonely widows of their savings. Then she vanished, and he went on alone. That was 20 years ago. Miss Marple nodded. Not coincidence, Colonel. Consequence. Mrs. Wright of our village was once Mrs. Lydia Crone. The Colonel stared. Good heavens! Are you sure? I'm afraid so. The photograph confirms it. She must have reinvented herself after leaving him, perhaps even after his supposed accident. He, however, found her again, and she poisoned him to keep her secret. Possibly, but I rather think she meant only to frighten him. Cyanide, after all, is treacherous a measure. A pinch too much, and the threat becomes a deed. And then, when Mrs. Price really began to suspect, our Mrs. Wright arranged a most certain silence. The Colonel shook his head slowly. She doesn't look the type. No one ever does, Miss Marple said softly. Evil, Colonel, is often dressed in good manners. That night, St. Mary Mead lay under a restless wind. Miss Marple, sleepless, sat by a fire and listened to the branches tapping at the window. She thought of Lydia Wright, clever, frightened, proud, a woman who had clawed her way from scandal to respectability, and who would not let a ghost from the past drag her down again. She thought, too, of justice, not the kind written in law, but the quiet reckoning that came to all souls in time. At last, she reached for her writing paper. A brief note to Inspector Craddock. Dear Inspector, I believe the truth of both deaths may be found in the late Mrs. Wright's garden. Look to the flower bed beneath the window. There, I think, you will find what remains of the fortune-teller's bottle of poison, and perhaps something more besides. Yours sincerely, Jane Marple. She sealed it and placed it on the hall table for the Morning Post. Outside, the wind sighed through the yews, carrying with the faintest scent of roses and gas. And Miss Marple, at last, allowed herself to sleep. Part 4. The Whispering Tent. There are moments in St. Mary Mead when the very air seems to hold its breath. That night, following the accident, or the supposed accident, at the autumn fair, the village lay under a thin mist. It drifted like gauze over the hedgerows, dimming the lanterns that still hung from the fairground gates. A few scraps of bunting flapped softly in the breeze, like reminders of cheer turned to worry. Miss Marple, who never trusted official explanations made in haste, sat in her cottage parlor with a shawl about her shoulders. A pot of cocoa cooled on the table beside her, untouched. Her mind was busy tracing, in its own quiet way, the pattern of the day's events. The smiling fortune-teller, the trembling curate, the sudden collapse of Mr. Fletcher beneath the Ferris wheel, and, above all, that curious scent of almond drifting through the autumn air. She had telephoned the vicar, as propriety demanded, to ask after poor Mr. Fletcher's widow. But Mrs. Fletcher had not returned home. She had, it seemed, vanished amid the confusion. The local constable, young P.C. Lennox, had taken statements enclosed a fairground, but Miss Marple suspected that his sense of order stopped at the edges of his notebook. As the clock ticked toward midnight, she rose, wrapped herself in a darker shawl, and stepped out into the mist. The lane to the meadow was silent save for the occasional hoot of an owl. Her shoes made little sound on the damp earth. Once she thought she heard another pair of footsteps, light and uncertain, following a little way behind. But when she turned there was nothing, only the hedge and the thin vapor rising from the ditch. At the gate of the fairground she paused. A constable's lantern glimmered near the gate haze, where a chain now barred entry. But Miss Marple, who had known the village before the young man was born, knew another way in, through a gap in the hedge behind the poultry tent. She smiled faintly to herself. It was surprising what one remembered when one took the trouble to observe. Inside the fairground, the silence was almost theatrical. The booths stood like ghosts under the mist. The painted horses of the carousel gleamed dully, their open mouths frozen mid-cry. The fortune-teller's tent, however, still gave off a faint glow. Miss Marple drew closer. A single candle flickered within, and as she approached she heard a soft murmur, two voices, one low and hurried, the other strained. She stopped outside the flap, just within the shadows. "I told you," hissed a woman's voice. "He wouldn't go through with it. He was too frightened. "And I told you," a man replied, "that once the bottle was opened, there was no going back. It had to look like an accident." Miss Marple's heart gave one small, decisive thump. She waited, listening, every nerve attuned. "Keep your voice down," the woman said again. "If anyone sees us—" "No one will," the man interrupted. "By morning it'll all be over. She's on her way out of the village now." A rustle, a scrape of a chair, and then silence. Miss Marple stepped back as quietly as she had come. She heard the flap open, saw two shadowy figures slip away in opposite directions. She recognized neither, but she marked the man's uneven gait, perhaps a limp, and the woman's perfume, cloying and sharp, the same she had noticed when Mrs. Fletcher fainted at the tea tent that afternoon. She waited until the fairground lay still once more before approaching the fortune-teller's tent. Inside, the air smelled of incense and cheap scent. The candle burned low beside a deck of tarot cards. Upon the table lay an empty phial, its label half-torn but still legible. Bitter almond essence, for external use. Miss Marple pursed her lips. "Ah," she murmured, "so that's how it was done." She pocketed the phial carefully, pinched out the candle, and slipped away through the hedge. The mist had thickened, and her cottage light was a mere glow across the field. She felt the unease that always came when human malice revealed its shape. Yet there was also, beneath it, a quiet purpose. She had glimpsed a pattern now. The threads were beginning to show. Morning came pale and cold. The village awoke to the news that Mrs. Fletcher had been found, alive but distraught, wandering near the railway station. She spoke wildly of voices in the night, of threats, of her husband's secrets. The police, at first, dismissed it as hysteria. But Miss Marple knew better. She arrived at the vicarage just as Inspector Graves was concluding his interview. The inspector, a practical man with a fondness for tea and skepticism, greeted her with resigned courtesy. "Morning, Miss Marple. I dare say you've heard the fuss. The widow's in quite a state." "I have, Inspector. Poor soul. Grief takes many forms." Her eyes rested on the small bottle the inspector had placed on the table. "Might I see that?" He hesitated, then nodded. She examined the label, identical to the one she had found in the tent. "Where did this come from?" she asked. "From the vicarage kitchen, of all places," he said grimly. "Seems the parish ladies used it for icing yesterday's cakes." "Indeed?" Miss Marple said softly. "I wonder, did anyone notice who handled the bottles before they were brought to the fair?" He frowned. "You think the poisoning started there?" "I think," said Miss Marple, "that someone intended Mr. Fletcher to taste bitterness, literally and figuratively. He was not a popular man, I gather." The inspector shrugged. He had his disputes. Money, mostly. "Yes," she said, "and secrets, too. The sort that people kill to keep or to silence." She left the vicarage soon after, her mind turning over the fragments she had gathered. The fortune-teller's tent, the missing widow, the bottle of essence, the quarrel by the gate, and that faint perfume. Every clue pointed not to chance but to design. At midday she walked to the post office, where she encountered young Miss Hartley, the seamstress who had run the fortune-telling store for fun. Her hands shook as she sorted letters. "Oh, Miss Marple. Terrible, isn't it? Poor Mr. Fletcher, he always seemed so well." "Indeed," Miss Marple said gently. "Tell me, my dear, did anyone help you set up your tent last night?" "Why, yes, Mr. Fletcher himself. He insisted on fixing the lanterns for me. Said he had a steady hand." Miss Marple's eyes softened. "And did he mention meeting anyone?" Miss Hartley thought for a moment. Only that someone had warned him not to eat the fair cakes. "I thought it a joke." Miss Marple smiled faintly. A strange joke indeed. That afternoon, a light rain began to fall, turning the fairground mud to mirror. The inspector ordered another search. Miss Marple, standing at the edge with her umbrella, watched as constables turned over crates and tables. Presently a shout went up. They had found something buried behind the tea tent, a small box containing letters bound with a blue ribbon. Inside were notes signed by Mrs. Fletcher, and another hand, a man's, speaking of debts, a betrayal, of money hidden and promises broken. Miss Marple's eyes twinkled, though her voice remained mild. It seems, Inspector, that a fair conceal more than amusements. He grunted. Blackmail, perhaps. But who killed him, then? I believe, said Miss Marple, we are dealing not with a single act of rage, but with a partnership, a pair who thought themselves cleverer than they are. She told him quietly what she had overheard near the tent. The inspector's brows rose, but he knew better than to doubt her. You heard that yourself. I did, and I think, if we pay a visit to the manor stables this evening, we shall find one of the speakers nursing a limp, and perhaps a conscience. Evening drew down again, and the mist returned as if it had never left. Miss Marple accompanied the inspector to Silverwood Lodge, where the fair's horses had been stabled. There, by lantern light, they found Mr. Harris, the fair's accountant, tending a sprained ankle. His face turned pale when he saw them. Within minutes the truth began to surface. The poisoned bottle, the forged letters, the plan to make Mr. Fletcher's death appear accidental so the debts would die with him. But there was another accomplice yet unseen, the woman with the cloying perfume. When they asked who she was, Harris faltered, then whispered a name, Miss Hartley. Miss Marple only sighed. Poor child, she said softly. A tidy hand with a needle and with deceit. That night, as the rain washed the fairground clean, Miss Marple returned home. She placed a little file upon her mantel, beside the porcelain cat, another small piece of wickedness neatly folded away. And yet, as she looked out upon the damp garden, she could still hear the faint echo of the fair, the laughter that had turned to screams, the music that had died mid-note. In St Mary Mead, evil seldom shouted. It whispered, softly, beneath the ordinary. Part 5, Secrets at Silverwood Lodge. The next morning dawned gray and listless, as if the very sky were wearied by the revelations of the night before. Miss Marple sat at her breakfast table, stirring her tea absent-mindedly, while the village gossip drifted in through her open window like the autumn breeze itself. Mr. Harris, the fair's accountant, had been taken into custody, though the constable reported that his story changed with every telling. As for Miss Hartley, the seamstress-turned-fortune-teller, she was said to be resting at her aunt's cottage under the vicar's care, a phrase that, in St. Mary Mead, covered a multitude of moral ailments. Miss Marple, however, was not entirely satisfied. She never was, until every thread lay neat and true. Something still troubled her about the sequence of events. If Miss Hartley had been the poisoner, why had she seemed genuinely frightened of the Fae? And if Mr. Harris had plotted with her, what had driven them to such desperate measures? She rose, fetched her shawl, and decided that answers were best pursued before luncheon. Silverwood Lodge lay at the far end of the village, a fine old house whose grandeur had faded like an old portrait left too long in the sun. Ivy clung to its walls, and the windows were veiled with dust. It had once belonged to the Fletcher family before business misfortunes and debts forced its sale. Miss Marple arrived at the gate just as the housekeeper, Mrs. Perry, came out with a basket of laundry. "Good morning, Mrs. Perry," Miss Marple said pleasantly. "Such a gloomy day for washing, though I dare say you've seen worse." Mrs. Perry, who had a fondness for Miss Marple's gentle manner, smiled weakly. "It's been a dreadful business. Poor Mr. Fletcher. He had his faults, but he didn't deserve such an end." "No, indeed," Miss Marple replied, watching the woman's eyes. "I understand he still kept a few things here, even after the sale." Mrs. Perry hesitated, her hands tightening on the basket. "Just some boxes in the attic. His papers, mostly. The new owners let him keep them until he got back on his feet. Bless them." Miss Marple nodded thoughtfully. "And has anyone been up there since?" "Only Mr. Harris. He came to collect them a fortnight ago. Said he was helping Mr. Fletcher set things in order before the Fae." "Ah!" Miss Marple smiled faintly. "How very helpful of him." Inside, the house smelled of damp wood and lavender polish. Mrs. Perry, unable to resist Miss Marple's gentle persistence, led her to the small upstairs room that served as an office. Dust lay thick on the desk. Miss Marple's I caught the faint outline of something recently moved. "Did Mr. Harris remove everything?" she asked. "Everything but one ledger," Mrs. Perry replied. said it was too heavy to bother with. The ledger sat on the shelf, its spine cracked and corners frayed. Miss Marple drew it out with careful hands. Inside were neat columns of figures, but several pages had been torn away. On the inside cover was a note in Mr. Fletcher's bold handwriting. Harris to pay upon completion. No further delay tolerated. Beneath it, in a different hand, smaller, neater, almost feminine, were the words, "He knows. We must act soon." Miss Marple closed the book softly. "How very revealing," she murmured. She left the lodge soon after, her steps slow and thoughtful. Outside, the mist had returned, coiling about the hedges. She paused at the gate, hearing a rustle from the stables. A moment later, Miss Hartley emerged, pale and drawn, a cloak pulled about her shoulders. "Miss Marple," she gasped. "I didn't expect— Oh, I shouldn't be here." "My dear," said Miss Marple kindly, "you should be wherever your conscience requires you to be. Have you come to fetch something?" Miss Hartley's eyes filled with tears. It wasn't supposed to happen like this. He said it would be simple, that no one would get hurt. But when Mr. Fletcher drank the tea, she covered her face. "I wanted to stop it." "Then why didn't you?" Miss Hartley's shoulders shook. "Because I was afraid of him. Mr. Harris. He said he'd tell everyone about the letters, the ones I wrote when I thought I loved him." Miss Marple placed a gentle hand on her arm. "My dear child, men who threaten with secrets are always cowards at heart. They rely upon the good nature of others to do their wicked work." Miss Hartley looked up miserably. "Will they hang him?" Miss Marple's voice was calm but grave. "That depends on whether he poisoned alone, or whether someone else set the plan in motion." The girl stared. "Someone else." Miss Marple's eyes softened. "There is nearly always someone else. A whisperer, a persuader, one who lets others soil their hands. Tell me, Miss Hartley, who first suggested that Mr. Fletcher might be better off dead." Miss Hartley hesitated, then whispered, "It wasn't Mr. Harris. It was Mrs. Fletcher." For a long moment, Miss Marple said nothing. She simply nodded, as though confirming something she had long suspected. "Thank you, my dear," she said quietly. "You've done a brave thing. Go home now. Tell the vicar everything." As Miss Hartley hurried away down the misty lane, Miss Marple stood beneath the bare chestnut tree, her thoughts like threads weaving themselves into place. The widow, the poison, the fortune-teller's tent, it all aligned. Mrs. Fletcher, long humiliated by her husband's debts and his harsh temper, had enlisted Harris and the girl to act in her stead. She had chosen her pawns with care, weaving her innocence from their weakness. But even the cleverest spider leaves a trail in the dew. That afternoon, Miss Marple called upon Inspector Graves once more. She found him pacing before the station fire, pipe unlit, frustration etched on his face. "Ah, Miss Marple," he sighed, "I thought you'd have something to say about all this." "I do indeed, Inspector," she replied serenely. "I believe you will find Mrs. Fletcher has a little box in a traveling case, one that once held a bottle of bitter almond essence." He stared. "The widow?" But she seemed half-mad with grief. "Grief," said Miss Marple softly, "is a convenient disguise for guilt, especially when one has planned it carefully." Graves frowned. "You're sure of this?" "As sure," said Miss Marple, "as one can be of human nature, and I have never known it to fail me." That evening, as the constables brought Mrs. Fletcher in, Miss Marple sat once more by her cottage fire. The wind stirred the curtains, and the scent of damp leaves filled the room. She poured herself a fresh cup of tea and reflected, as she often did, on the frailty of the human heart, how love, when twisted by bitterness, could turn as deadly as poison in a teacup. Outside, the last of the fairground lights were being dismantled. Children's laughter echoed faintly in the distance, already turning to memory. And Miss Marple, watching the embers glow, thought sadly, it is always the quiet ones who think no one will notice. Part 6. The Widow's Confession. The day after Mrs. Fletcher's arrest broke bright and wind-cleansed, the kind of autumn morning that made even St Mary Mead's most cynical inhabitants speak of blessings. Yet behind the lace curtains and teacups, conversation fluttered like startled sparrows. Everyone had an opinion about the widow, poor thing, wicked thing, pitiful soul, depending on who was speaking and how much sugar they took in their tea. Miss Marple, meanwhile, sat at her desk, sorting a small pile of letters she had borrowed from the police. They were part of the cash found at the fairground, now properly tagged and numbered. Most were dull, lists of debts, unpaid bills, but one, written in Mrs. Fletcher's hand, drew her attention. "He believes I shall forgive him," it read. "He does not understand that forgiveness can take many forms." The words were neat, deliberate, almost serene. It was not the writing of a frantic woman, but of one who had planned her emotions carefully. She was still contemplating the letter when Inspector Graves arrived, hat in hand. "Morning, Miss Marple. Thought you might like to know. We had a bit of a scene down at the station. The widow's asked to make a full statement, but she'll only speak if you're present." Miss Marple looked up, mild surprise in her eyes. "Me, Inspector? She says you're the only one who'll understand." At the station, Mrs. Fletcher sat in a straight-back chair, hands folded neatly in her lap. Her dark dress, creased and travel-worn, did nothing to dim the proud tilt of her head. She looked less like a prisoner than a weary hostess forced to entertain uninvited guests. When Miss Marple entered, the widow's composure flickered, then steadied. "Thank you for coming, Miss Marple. I imagine you already know what I've done." Miss Marple's tone was gentle. "I know what others have done for you, perhaps, but not why." Mrs. Fletcher gave a small, bitter smile. "Why does anyone do such things? Love, money, humiliation, take your pick." Inspector Graves shifted uneasily behind the desk. "Best to tell it plain. Madam, we'll need a full account." The widow's gaze remained fixed on Miss Marple. "He ruined me," she said softly. "Ruined everything we had. The house, the accounts, even my family's good name. And when there was nothing left to sell, he turned to deceit. I found out only by chance. Letters, receipts, a loan taken in my name. He laughed when I confronted him. Said no one would believe a hysterical woman." Her voice did not tremble. It cooled. "I wanted to leave him. But women like me, where are we to go? So I decided he should leave instead." Miss Marple inclined her head slightly. "You used Mr. Harris and the girl to make it seem accidental." Mrs. Fletcher nodded once. "He trusted Harris. He would drink anything the man offered. And poor Lydia, she believed she was helping the man she loved. I didn't tell her the truth. I said it was only to make him ill, to frighten him." She drew a long breath. "When he fell, I thought I'd be free. But freedom bought that way doesn't last. You see the guilt every morning in the mirror, staring back." Miss Marple said nothing for a moment, then spoke softly. "And yet you chose to confess." "Yes." The widow's composure cracked at last, her hands twisted together. "Because when you came to see me at the vicarage, I saw in your eyes that you already knew. You looked at me as if I were still human. I couldn't bear that kindness." There was silence. The inspector cleared his throat and began taking notes. But Miss Marple's thoughts drifted beyond the room, to the fairground, the mist, the childish music that had masked the darker dance of envy and despair. At length she said quietly, "You may find, Mrs. Fletcher, that truth, once spoken, can be a kind of mercy. It seldom frees us from punishment, but it lightens the soul." Mrs. Fletcher bowed her head. "Then perhaps that will have to do." Later, as the widow was led away, Inspector Graves turned to Miss Marple with a sigh. "You were right again. I don't know how you do it." "Oh, it's very simple, Inspector," she said, gathering her gloves. "One merely remembers that people behave as they always have. Motives may wear new hats, but the faces beneath them never change." He smiled wryly. "Still, it's a pity. A handsome woman, clever too." "Yes," Miss Marple replied. "Clever enough to believe she could shape justice to her own design. That's a very old mistake." That evening, the village returned to its ordinary rhythms. Cows milked, fires lit, children sent to bed. At the edge of the green, the dismantled fairground was nearly gone, save for one lonely tent pole that jutted against the darkening sky. Miss Marple passed it on her way home, her steps slow and thoughtful. At her gate she met young P.C. Lennox, who tipped his cap. "Evening. Guess all settled now." "Almost," she said with a faint smile. "Only the gossip remains, and that, my dear, never quite ends." He chuckled awkwardly. "Folks say you see things before they happen." Miss Marple's eyes twinkled. "Oh, no. I merely listen while others talk. It's remarkable what truth can be found in small remarks, if one attends to them." He nodded, a little mystified, and went on his way. Inside, Miss Marple lit her lamp and placed a final letter, the widow's confession, beside her teacup. She would give it to the inspector tomorrow, but for now it rested in her keeping, a symbol of the frail balance between wickedness and remorse. She sat by the fire, knitting needles clicking softly, her thoughts weaving as steadily as her wool. So many tragedies, she mused, begin with a simple act of pride. And pride, once wounded, poisoned faster than any almond essence. The clock chimed 9. Outside, the night was calm, the village still. Somewhere a dog barked, answered by another farther off. The sound comforted her. It was the ordinary world, enduring after evil had been folded back into silence. She rose, drew her curtains, and murmured as she extinguished the lamp, "Tomorrow will be washing day, and perhaps, yes, a fine day for chrysanthemums." Part 7. The Autumn Garden. There was a certain stillness about St Mary Mead in the weeks that followed Mrs. Fletcher's confession, as though the village itself had paused to take breath after an unpleasant gust of weather. The fairground had long vanished from a meadow. The last of its ruts had been softened by rain, and the green was once again a place for children's games and gossiping mothers. Life, as Miss Marple often reflected, has a remarkable talent for smoothing over horror, provided it is not one's own. She was in her garden that morning, pruning the late roses, and thinking that autumn always seemed the most forgiving of seasons. It concealed decay with color, covered sorrow in a pleasant rustle of leaves. Yet beneath the loveliness, nature went about her business of endings. The gate clicked, and she looked up to see the vicar's wife, Mrs. Haydock, approaching with her usual brisk step and a basket of apples. "My dear Miss Marple, how you managed to look so serene after such dreadful goings-on, I shall never know," said Mrs. Haydock, setting down the basket. "The whole affair has quite unsettled everyone. The grocer says he can't even look at a packet of almonds without thinking of poison." Miss Marple smiled faintly. "That's rather an inconvenient association, considering how often almonds are used in baking." Mrs. Haydock shuddered, half laughing. "Indeed, though between ourselves, I never much cared for the Fletchers. He was quite impossible, and she, well, one never really knew her." "One seldom does," Miss Marple said mildly, snipping a final rose. "But I dare say we might all surprise each other, given the right or wrong circumstances." Mrs. Haydock looked momentarily puzzled, then decided philosophy was best left to clergymen. She departed with assurances that Miss Marple must call for tea very soon, and that the apples were quite sound this year. When the gate clicked shut again, Miss Marple stood for a while, pruning shears idle in her gloved hands. She was thinking of Mrs. Fletcher's last words at the station, the quiet relief in her face when she had spoken the truth at last. It was, Miss Marple supposed, the closest thing to redemption some souls could hope for. Later that day, she took her customary walk to the churchyard, where the Fletchers were now both buried, one by death, one by disgrace. A low wind sighed through the yews, carrying the scent of damp earth and fading blooms. She paused before the new stone, simple and unadorned. Someone, perhaps the vicar's wife, had placed a small bunch of chrysanthemums there. Miss Marple added one of her own, white and pure, and stood a moment in thought. She was not sentimental, not in the way that modern people sometimes thought kindness required. But she did feel a certain sorrow for the waste of it all, the bitterness that might have been softened, the love that might have been mended had pride not stood in the way. Human nature, she mused, was much like a garden, full of hidden roots and tangled stems, capable of beauty but always edging toward decay if not tended carefully. As she turned to leave, she found Inspector Graves waiting by the gate, hat in hand. "Miss Marple," he said with a smile, "I thought I might find you here. The case is closed at last. Mrs. Fletcher will go before the judge next week. The jury won't take long, I expect." Miss Marple nodded gently. "No, They seldom do when appearances are clear. It is only the unseen motives that take longer to untangle. Graves chuckled. I'll say this much. You make a policeman's work both easier and more humbling. She smiled faintly. I merely look for what people try to hide, Inspector. And most people are dreadfully bad at hiding what they feel. They walked together toward the LYCH gate. Do you ever tire of it? He asked, seeing through all the pretense. Oh, dear me, yes, she replied softly. But one mustn't turn away from the truth, however unpleasant. If one does, it tends to grow rather like bindweed. The inspector laughed, touched his hat, and went his way, leaving Miss Marple to stroll back through the lane. At home, she found a letter waiting on her table. The handwriting was unfamiliar, though the paper was good, heavy, cream-colored, with a faint scent of violets. She slit it open with a hairpin. Dear Miss Marple, I write to thank you, not for saving me, for that cannot be done, but for seeing me clearly. It is a strange comfort to be known, even in one's ruin. Tell Miss Hartley that I forgive her, and tell Mr. Harris that he was right about one thing. Guilt is a more lasting prison than any made of stone. Yours faithfully, Clara Fletcher. Miss Marple read it twice before folding it carefully and placing it in her writing box. She sat very still for some moments, gazing at the fading light beyond the curtains. Poor soul, she murmured at last. She mistook revenge for justice, and found neither. That evening, as twilight bled gently into night, Miss Marple lit her fire and made herself a simple supper. Outside, the village carried on. Children's laughter, a cart rumbling along the road, the faint chime of the church clock marking the hour. All seemed peaceful again, yet Miss Marple knew that peace was merely the surface of things. Beneath it, hearts still plotted, worried, loved, and sinned, as they always had and always would. She poured her tea, added precisely one sugar cube, and settled in her chair. The flames cast long shadows on the walls, and her knitting needles clicked softly in the hush. Somewhere beyond the garden, the owls had begun their low, mournful calls. To Miss Marple, it was not a sound of sorrow but of continuity, a reminder that life, in all its frailty, went on. She looked into the fire and thought of the fairground lights that had glittered so brightly, only to vanish in smoke and silence. It was a pattern she had seen many times before, the glittering surface of gaiety concealing darker currents beneath. And yet, she smiled faintly. There was beauty still, beauty in understanding, in truth, in the steady work of kindness that healed where evil had torn. When the clock struck 10, Miss Marple rose, drew her curtains, and murmured her nightly prayer, half gratitude, half reflection. She blew out the lamp, leaving the fire to fade on its own. The room settled into gentle darkness. Outside, the first leaves of November rustled against the window pane, and in that small, quiet cottage, the mind of one elderly woman rested, not in triumph, but in the peace that comes from knowing one has done what one could, as wisely and as kindly as possible. Part 8. The Quiet Return. It was a mild November morning in St Mary Mead when life, in its unhurried English fashion, settled back into its familiar pattern of small comforts and smaller disturbances. The scandal of the autumn fair had begun to fade, like the colors of the season itself. Yet for those with observant minds, certain ripples of consequence remained. At the post office, there were still murmurs about Mrs. Fletcher's state of mind, delivered in voices full of pity but eyes bright with curiosity. The vicar had given a sermon on mercy, which several of his parishioners had privately decided was all very well for some, but not quite practical. Miss Marple, however, had said nothing of the matter since the trial concluded. She had listened to the chatter with her usual mild attention, but her thoughts were elsewhere, on quieter, subtler things. There was, she felt, something profoundly instructive in how evil so often sprang not from malice but from wounded affection, from pride or fear, or the desperate wish to be loved. That morning she received a visitor, Mr. Harris, the widower whose fortune had drawn so much unkind attention. He looked older now, thinner, with a sadness that clung to his manner despite his attempt at politeness. "I thought I ought to thank you, Miss Marple," he said, once she had settled him with tea and seed cake. "The police told me it was you who saw what no one else did." "Oh, "My dear Mr. Harris," she said kindly, "it wasn't anything extraordinary. I merely noticed what anyone might have done if they'd been looking properly." He smiled faintly. "You make it sound easy, but I dare say that's a gift of wisdom." Miss Marple inclined her head modestly. "Observation, Mr. Harris, and a little memory. People behave much the same in every place and every time. It's only the costumes that change." He looked into his cup for a long moment before saying softly, "I've decided to sell the cottage. Too many ghosts, I'm afraid." "Yes," Miss Marple said gently, "that can happen. But one must remember, ghosts are really only the echoes of conscience. They follow us, not the place." He looked up at her sharply, as if her words had touched the truth he'd rather not face. After a pause, he nodded. "Perhaps. Still, I think I should like a fresh start. My sister has invited me to Devon." "Devon is a lovely place," she said. "Sea air is a fine tonic for the spirit." When he left, Miss Marple stood by her window a while, watching him walk away, alone, but straighter somehow, as if the telling of his plan had lightened him. That afternoon, she went calling upon Miss Hartley, the schoolmistress who had unwittingly become entangled in the affair. The poor woman had been through a trial of whispers herself, though Miss Marple had quietly ensured that the truth of her innocence was well understood. Miss Hartley received her with visible gratitude. "You were right, Miss Marple. About Mrs. Fletcher, about everything. I ought to have trusted my instincts sooner." Miss Marple smiled gently. "One never does, my dear. Instinct is simply experience that has learned to whisper instead of shout." They took tea by the small coal fire, and Miss Hartley confessed she meant to leave teaching for a while. "I think perhaps I should write," she said shyly. "Something simple, perhaps about village life." "That would be very suitable," Miss Marple approved. "After all, there's no better subject than human nature, and no setting that shows it so clearly." Miss Hartley laughed softly. "Do you think anyone would read such a thing?" "My dear," Miss Marple said, smiling, "I should think everyone would. It's the same reason people listen to gossip. They cannot resist the puzzle of other people's hearts." As she walked home, dusk was settling over St Mary Mead. The sky had turned a pale gold behind the church spire, and smoke curled lazily from the chimneys. Children's laughter floated from the lane, where the last of the leaves danced underfoot. Miss Marple paused at the gate of her garden, taking in the familiar scent of damp earth and late roses. She thought of how time itself seemed to fold neatly around such places, years passing, seasons changing, yet the essence remaining the same. Inside, she lit her lamp and drew the curtains. The cottage was as it had always been, tidy, warm, a world of its own. On her writing desk lay the letter from Mrs. Fletcher, which she had read once more that morning. She had not replied. It was impossible to, but she kept it there as a small, solemn reminder. The world, she thought, is rarely divided neatly into villains and victims. There are only people, sometimes kind, sometimes cruel, often frightened, and almost always capable of both harm and grace. That evening, she took up her knitting once again, a new scarf this time, in soft grays and blues. As her needles moved, her mind wandered over the weeks past, the fairground lights, the poison cup, the quiet confession beneath the autumn sky. And as she knitted, she thought of all the small mercies that had followed, the schoolmistress's freedom, the inspector's understanding, even Mr. Harris's new beginning. It was, she decided, a kind of pattern to, like the scarf or the lives of those around her. Each stitch, each choice, linking to another. Mistakes could not be undone, but they might be mended, covered, or reworked into something quietly beautiful. Outside, the wind picked up, whispering through the hedges. A cat crossed the path, pausing briefly to glance toward her window before vanishing into the night. Miss Marple smiled to herself. "Well," she murmured, "another little mystery, where cats go after dark." At 9, the church bell rang across the fields. The sound was low and peaceful, carrying over the rooftops of St. Mary Mead. Miss Marple listened, set aside her knitting, and went to her window. Beyond the glass, the moon had risen pale and full over the meadow where the fair one stood. The grass was smooth again, No sign of the booths or bright lights, only the soft silver of moonlight and the faint trace of the Ferris wheel circle, marked in dew. It was as though the earth itself remembered, silently, what had passed. Miss Marple drew the curtains, extinguished a lamp, and whispered, "Good night, my days." Her voice, though soft, seemed to hold the weight of all she had seen and known, the sorrows, the kindnesses, the peculiar frailty of human hearts. The cottage grew still, the fire sank to embers, and beyond the garden gate, the quiet lanes of St Mary Mead lay bathed in moonlight, peaceful, for now,